Hi, and welcome to the UAE Tech Podcast, an exploration on how technology is merging with and reshaping government in the United Arab Emirates. From our offices in Amman, Jordan and Media City, Dubai, I'm your host, John Lillywhite, with Bawaba Business. Smart City Internet of Things devices at parking meters. Government departments for artificial intelligence and blockchain, experiments in Hyperloop travel. A little understood but fundamental transition is taking place in the United Arab Emirates, a country first established less than 50 years ago in 1971. It's here that the center of technological gravity is shifting from the private sector to a hybrid relationship involving industrialists, entrepreneurs, diplomats, policymakers, creatives, and citizens. It's also here that signs of a fourth industrial revolution, new social and economic patterns, changes in how we interact with each other across time, distance, and space are emerging. In this series, we'll speak with leaders from across the UAE in an effort to map these macro trends and probe how innovations in big data, network science, and digitalization are not simply revolutionizing government, but could, one day, reshape the systems that power global civilization itself. From our offices in Amman, Jordan and Media City, Dubai, I'm your host, John Lillywhite with Bawaba Business, and this is the UAE Tech Podcast.
Over the last 5 years, they have started to consolidate their efforts in a way that I've never seen before. And a good example of that is perhaps, let's talk about the blockchain initiative in general. So this was something that Dubai saw great value in about 4 or 5 years ago, actually 4 years ago. And they said it is very early on. Governments are quite scared of this. Banks are running scared of this. And so instead of running away and putting this under the rug, let us find a way to conduct real dialogue with players from around the world and engage policymakers as well as investors in the country to say, is this technology something to be scared of? Is this something that will make us redundant? And if so, how can we make that transition within the confines of what we think the nation needs in the next 15 or 20 years?
Danish Farhan describes himself as someone who is building nations with stories. His personal story, and the story of Xische and Co, the company he founded as a 19-year-old, are intimately connected to several of the trends taking place in the UAE right now. Danish and his team have been directly involved in everything from smart city planning to the UAE's Global Blockchain Council, its artificial intelligence strategy, as well as projects that involve auditing happiness or collaborating with a government-backed future technology accelerator. As such, Danish is the perfect person to introduce and provide an overview to how government and technology are merging inside the UAE at the same time as influencing the rest of the world. Danish, thanks so much for being with us here today. So for listeners from outside the Middle East or outside of the UAE who are curious about technology in Dubai and curious about what's happening in the ecosystem in Dubai, you're a really interesting person to speak to because your company, Xische and Co, seems to be involved in so much of what's going on, from blockchain to smart cities to IoT to automation to government policy and research. So I thought, just to kick off, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, what Xische and Co does, and how you kind of got involved into this space?
That's a very elaborate introduction. Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be here. I like to call ourselves an 18-year-old startup, and that is often how I describe us to governments that we work with, as well as the real startups that have been around for a couple of weeks or so. And perhaps the ideal way of telling you how we got to where we are at the moment is to tell you how we started. So we call ourselves anti-disciplinarians, which is a really complex word, but it essentially means we're perpetual outsiders. We're not from within the industries that we operated in over the last 2 decades or so. And what we do today, in a really simple form, is to say that we help clients understand themselves, build on their strengths, and tell unforgettable stories. Everything that we do within the group really fits within these three buckets. The way that we service our clients is almost limitless. It could start off with an advisory role, move into storytelling or crafting a narrative at a national level, through to helping implement something at the cutting edge of technology, and then move on to researching the effectiveness of some of these initiatives, and then proceed with helping future leaders understand the toolkit to build their leadership skills and lead a nation like the UAE to the future. So that's sort of a combination of things that we do under the group, Xische.
Yeah, okay, so let's zoom in on some of that, because there's a lot there. So I think I remember when I first saw Xische, probably maybe 5-6 years ago. I was based in Jordan at the time. And I thought, oh wow, I like these guys. They're a bunch of creatives. They're into digital culture. They're into writing. They're into creativity. They clearly know about what's going on in the startup ecosystem, but they also know about the creative scene and what's happening in the Middle East generally. But looking at you guys today, you've got under your portfolio, you've got design, but you've also got strategy, reports, Xische Academy. So all those things you were just talking about seem to be structured under those headings. How do they work together? How do they work together, and what are you trying to achieve as a whole with all of those different aspects in the company?
I think that's a great question, and I love how you touched on all of those verticals. So you had alluded to wanting to know what Xische means, and I want to tell you a little bit of a story of how the name came about. So when we were setting up the firm in 2000, I literally went through the entire dictionary to try and see what word would help symbolize the philosophy of what we wanted to create back in the day. And this was before the internet had really become mainstream. There were perhaps less than 100 websites in the UAE at that point, including the little blogs with photographs of T-shirts and things. I mean, I'm talking very early days. We realized that the web or digital tech is going to transform the region in a drastic way, and that somehow we were asleep at the wheel as a region. We hadn't really embraced it the way that I thought we may have at that point in 1999 or 2000. And so when we started out, we really started off as digital players to help bridge the gap between corporate objectives or governmental objectives and being able to leverage the web in telling that story. So we started off as pure storytellers. So where your description of us as creatives is true. That was our first foray into helping solve problems and challenges for our clients. So over the years, we realized we were telling a good story, but storytelling is typically the end of the funnel. You've already thought about what you want to fix. You've figured out how you want to do it. You've rooted in research that you've already conducted. And so by the time it arrived at somebody like ours, we were just the mouthpiece. And because we were investors and entrepreneurs, we also started to understand the other end of the funnel. And I think we were in a position to demonstrate the value to the client, to say, we can work slightly upstream. We can help you define the strategy. We can help you figure out where to play to win. And then we can help do the research to be able to create a compelling case for business. And that's how we evolved into the strategic consultancy. And that was then rooted in helping train. So we don't believe in having clients depend on us over the course of years and years. So if there's a way that we can make ourselves redundant by design, that is real value addition to clients who will then respect the work and the ethos that you bring to the table. Because at the end of the day, in a country and a city as young as ours, which is 46 years old, we have, I think we've got to set the precedent of building leaders rather than trying to consolidate power. And that's something that we played up quite a lot over the last decade or so. So that's where the training came in, and the research was a byproduct. We were sitting on all of this deep insights on so much tech change at a governmental level.
Right.
And we thought it's a pity that this ends up as a little slide deck on somebody's desk. Instead, we thought, what if we were able to anonymize some of these learnings, create story-driven lessons for the rest of the world to understand the mechanics of how a 46-year-old nation has gotten to where it has in less than half a century. That's sort of really how it evolved into the different verticals.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So I suppose in one sense, what you're also implying there is that were it not for technology, the UAE wouldn't have been able to leapfrog as fast as it had in such a relatively short period of time. Do you have any?
I agree with you. Yes.
Yeah. Do you have any case studies in particular that you really like or are close to your heart that kind of illustrate a lot of the things you've been talking about? In terms of training leaders, working with the government, delivering change.
I'll keep this really quick, but in 1972 or 1973, an investor, a businessman out of the region, came to meet with the founding father of Dubai, His Highness Sheikh Rashid, and said, "I'd like to invest in a plot of land." And His Highness drove this gentleman out to what seemed like forever away from the city of Dubai, and said, "Here's some land, and I think this is ripe for investment." The businessman, the investor, sort of was quite offended at the offer and said, with all the respect, I think I'd like to withdraw the offer. We will perhaps connect another time. And that was the end of the story. 4.5 years later, during the sort of 78, 79, which is less than a decade since the Federation of the UAE was formed, this businessman is back again, and this time around he chances upon the same plot of land, which is now home to the largest construction site he had seen in the Middle East. And that was the birthplace of the Trade Center. Now, this is important for two reasons. One is it tells you the power of storytelling, which is what has driven Dubai, to be able to create this grand vision and then make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Trade Center was meant to be a prototype of what Dubai would then continue to sell for the next 5 decades, which is that you could build something which is one spot to live, work, and play without having to leave. And that's what the Trade Center was meant to be. It was Dubai's announcement to the world that we're here. And look at anything that Dubai launches today. It is exactly the same narrative. And this is now the second generation that is leading the city, and the narrative has remained the same. I think that's been, to me, a huge part of what's been so inspiring about living in a city like this, where it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and storytelling is such an important part of it.
Yeah. So I love that story. My startup that I used to run in the Middle East, and in part in the UAE, was all about storytelling from a slightly different perspective, basically fiction-based. And I love the fact that you're often talking about Oscar Wilde's famous quotation, life imitates art, also one of my favorites. I love that WEF story, but at the same time, and I think it's great we're talking to you as one of the initial people on this podcast, because for outsiders, particularly Brits, who can sometimes be a little bit negative about Dubai, I think there's two sides to this. I think on the one end, telling Dubai is a superpower when it comes to telling captivating stories and all sorts of multimedia about what it's achieved, and fair play to it, that that's great. I also think sometimes from the startup perspective or the creative perspective or even the government perspective, Dubai is doing so much, but ordinary people from outside the country find it hard to pass the great visuals and the great public relations with the substance of what's actually happening. If you think about the city of Dubai, it is objectively amazing, the city that has risen in such a short period of time out of the desert. And it's the same with a lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of smart cities, in terms of blockchain, in terms of automation. Behind the flashy visuals, there's actually some really serious thinking going on. And I think that the storytelling is a really important part of as everyone often comments, Dubai's soft power. But sometimes it's also nice to just get hold of someone like yourself and really kind of zone in on, these are the young leaders we're training, or this is actually what's happening on the ground in blockchain, and this is how this relates to other cities in the world. I think that's another reason why what Xische and Co is doing is interesting, because you've got the meta kind of storytelling, approach where you've said it yourself that you're building nations with stories, which is magnificent, And then on the other side, you've got the on the ground stuff that is really quite dynamic, and so I guess that's a good segue into what are the really cool things that you're seeing or you're working on in Dubai at the moment.
Sure. Okay, I think thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense. I think if you take the meta approach, you're able to connect the dots. And if you think of governments or cities in general, yes, they're looking to create progress, but it's hard to be able to say we're firing on all cylinders across all dimensions. And this is something that Dubai is now starting to leverage and do collaboratively. Dubai is in a peculiar position where people that did not know what the United Arab Emirates was knew what Dubai was in the 80s. And so Dubai was in many ways a city nation or city state, if you like. Today, however, people know Abu Dhabi, people know the UAE, but that wasn't always the case. So Dubai led the way. The UAE embraced a similar methodology or something quite different. But then over the last 5 years, they have started to consolidate their efforts in a way that I've never seen before. And a good example of that is perhaps, let's talk about the blockchain initiative in general. So this was something that Dubai saw great value in about 4 or 5 years ago, actually 4 years ago. And they said it is very early on. Governments are quite scared of this. Banks are running scared of this. And so instead of running away and putting this under the rug, let us find a way to conduct real dialogue with players from around the world and engage policymakers as well as investors in the country to say, is this technology something to be scared of? Is this something that will make us redundant? And if so, how can we make that transition within the confines of what we think the nation needs in the next 15 or 20 years, leveraging technology, like you say, Dubai does that well. And so it all started off with something called the Blockchain Council, where this was the first time where you had people from all verticals under one roof that would meet to talk about what is the difference between cryptography and blockchain? Why is cryptocurrency making the headline news while blockchain, the underlying technology, disappearing into the background? And can we deploy this at a governmental level? Does it make sense within a nation? Does it make sense between nations? And so they started this dialogue quite early. A couple of years into the Blockchain Council, they realized, I think it makes sense for Dubai to take the prototype approach that it does so well and say that we will mandate government transactions in a way, or government transactions that are relevant to embrace the blockchain. And let's put some KPIs and let's put some targets and let's go and make this announcement. So it wasn't just an announcement to capture the buzz around blockchain. So, I often use the analogy of Kim Kardashian, and so blockchain is this season's Kim Kardashian. Everyone's interested, but nobody knows why, and yet you use the words and everyone's interested, right? and I think that's been the way that Dubai has leveraged finding the right story or piggybacking the right story, so it makes a grand entrance. But it doesn't necessarily mean that just because you launch something, you're in the best position to be able to implement it. So I think the blockchain strategy of Dubai stated that if we look at just one use case, which is government paperwork that families and residents and investors in Dubai need to submit to the government, we could potentially save billions of dirhams. Yes, I'm saying billions, not millions of dirhams. So I think part of the work that we did with a coalition of partners on this was to be able to say, all right, let us figure out what is the average number of times somebody has to submit paperwork in the government today, to the government today. And we realized it was about 33 times a year that you've got a photocopy of your license, of your tenancy agreement, of your Emirates ID, or of your employment contract to somebody or the other. This is the fact. So photocopy, you physically have to drive to do this. And so we realized, okay, that's approximately 411 million kilometers driven every single year just to deliver paperwork to a government entity. And then we started to extrapolate from that. What does that mean for productivity? And it turns out that leads to 25 million hours of productivity loss. But what does that actually mean in terms of documentations? What is the scale we're talking about? Turns out families in Dubai generate 100 million government documents a year. That's not a joke. And if you put a monetary value on that, if you were to remove that burden from society, you would save 5.5 billion dirhams. That's upwards of $1 billion a year, which in a way, the storytelling angle of it is roughly the same cost of building the Burj Khalifa every single year. The moment we went out with this narrative, it was obvious people started to sit up and take notice and said, okay, this isn't some pseudo sort of geeky tech that people are talking about, and it's not the hipster way of taking the cryptocurrency conversation mainstream. No, this is real value. And that's kind of where Dubai said, all right, we're going to focus on government transactions. We're going to focus on on becoming the test bed for private sector startups to experiment within a sandbox using blockchain in the country or in the city of Dubai. And third, we're going to become the only city that helps build this ecosystem officially as the government, rather than a little conference here and a little roundtable there. That was the philosophy with which Dubai started off on its blockchain journey. Since then, they now have 22 active pilot projects that are underway as of last year. This is being driven by Smart Dubai, which is the custodian of the Smart City Initiative of Dubai, together with the Dubai Future Foundation. So both of them are driving this as a way to tangibly deliver projects out into the market.
That's fascinating. So when we talk about blockchain-powered government, it's not just a throwaway line. There's been a lot of thinking, a lot of collaboration, and strategy behind it.
Yes.
And I guess the other part of this that's kind of fascinating is, one of the things we're looking at in this podcast is the growing intersection of government and technology, which is a slightly more mature discussion to the one maybe 5 years ago, where it was very private sector, entrepreneur based. But the second thing is, the fourth industrial revolution, the capacity of, again, a relatively young country like the UAE to play a role in influencing global case studies and technologies that really could change many aspects of the economy, the global economy going forwards. Do you see that every day in your line of work, the extent to which Dubai is starting to influence things outside of its, and UAE, is starting to influence things outside of the country and outside of its borders?
Definitely, and I think I can tell you firsthand, as we speak at conferences and forums around the world, the moment you say you're helping drive change at the national level, people go, "Oh, great, that's fantastic." There's a dozen other people in the room doing that. But the moment you talk about the Dubai case study, everyone sits up and listens, because they know that this is something that's a prototype on steroids. Dubai as a city seems to be adopting that approach, where we're happy to fail, but we fail fast so that we can re-pivot ourselves and move on to the next big challenge. So I see that Dubai's sandbox approach is already starting to pay dividends in the number of people, both at the startup level, as well as policymakers from around the world, who are coming to Dubai to set up official bilateral agreements to say, can we exchange our learnings across the countries or across the cities and learn from the confines that you have, as well as deliver solutions that may have been more successful in parts of Europe. A great example of this is Estonia. Estonia is a phenomenal leader. I mean, so we think Dubai is young at 46 years old. Estonia is 27 years old. And look at the extent of their government infrastructure that is technology-driven and technology-led. Their e-residency program is really, truly the first of its kind. Their digital embassies, where they have replica databases of all of their digital information on their citizens in most of their embassies outside of Estonia. I mean, this is really forward thinking. And so for Estonia and Dubai to collaborate as they are at the moment is exceptional. I already see that as being a validation of Dubai taking the right approach, where forward thinkers that are already accomplishing big things at a global scale are starting to see value in the way Dubai is promoting use of tech to create radical disruption and create availability.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at some of the numbers in terms of investments. The UAE is investing not dissimilar amounts into kind of AI research as some European governments, and it's also moving at a speed that perhaps even the UK, judging by some of the white papers, they're often quoting what's going on in the UAE, which is super interesting. It's almost like you've got countries like the UAE and Estonia, which have almost taken a startup kind of attitude as an entire nation state, and they think we can compete with the much older, much more advanced industrial nations if we move fast and at pace and we innovate.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons I really enjoy working out of the Middle East too. But
right, and you've seen this over a long period of time, John. I think I like to use the terminology startup state, and I think it's the startup states in this decade and potentially in the next 2 decades that are creating the big change that the large incumbents like the United States, like China, like the EU, are not able to. And there's many reasons for that. The legislative framework with which you pass laws and relook at priorities, it does not exist in the same form in the UAE as it does in parts of Europe or the US. And so if you look at that axis, if you look at the axes of how the US is pro-business, the EU is pro-citizen, and China is pro-government, the UAE or other startup states like the UAE are very much across all three axes. And I think that's the secret of a small player creating a big impact, because they're embracing this middle ground approach. And you were mentioning AI and AI investments. Now imagine this, if we didn't use the word UAE or the name UAE, for us to say a country with under 10 million sort of population is on the global stage creating sort of discussions and dialogue at the World Economic Forum around artificial intelligence and being taken seriously by peers, it would have been unthinkable. So the fact that we say it's the UAE, people take it seriously. I mean, we have a Ministry of State for Artificial Intelligence, the first of its kind in the world. And the only way that they were able to get a seat on the grown-up table was because they said people are looking at the weaponization of AI, people are looking at the competitiveness of AI, people are looking at the tech ecosystem that breeds success in AI. And the UAE said, well, nobody's talking about governance and ethics as a real question and a real danger. And so they embrace that as the way that they look at AI, and suddenly they become the middle ground. So it's not just being that's what's allowed them to become a global voice in such a short span of time. So that's my take on this.
That is interesting, because I know that President Xi Jinping visited a couple of months ago, and apparently there was a lot of interest in the blockchain and AI strategy for the UAE. And on one level, that makes total sense. And I can see why China would be very interested and vice versa. On another level, in the UK, I know there were questions about data protection, AI and ethics. And what you're saying is that actually Dubai is a good faith player in that, and Dubai is looking at the regulation and the ethics and the laws around that just as much as Western democracies and the Europeans are.
Absolutely. And they're engaging stakeholders from the private sector as well as policymakers from not just the city but the country. And that's giving them this really unique advantage to prototype policies and laws around this. So we have something called the UAE Council for AI and Blockchain, and the representation across the council is so diverse, you'd be amazed. I mean, from the Ministry of Economy all the way through to health, to smart cities, to data. I mean, it's all driving what the future roadmap for AI needs to be. And there's KPIs for what the government needs to accomplish in the next 2-year time frame, in the next 5-year time frame, in the next 10-year time frame. Have you heard of the 1 million coders initiative?
No, I haven't. No.
So Sheikh Mohammed announced this thing as part of his humanitarian effort called the Mohammed bin Rashid Global Initiatives, and it's called the 1 Million Coders Initiative. And the idea here is to help drive the next generation of skilled workers from the Arab world and to catalyze it in any way, shape, or form. And the way they've done that is they've essentially played matchmaker between challenges that need solving using technology and finding opportunities for Arab nations around the world to collaborate in helping deliver on that challenge or to solve that challenge. And the target is 1 million coders, and we've got to get to that point. So you have people as diverse as Damak, a real estate player, through to universities. They're all chugging away towards this goal. And again, this is a great example of the grand story driving real change, which has byproducts which continue to, it becomes a self-fulfilling virtuous cycle. So yeah, tech as a way of tech sort of literacy or natively thinking with tech is certainly become the operating system for leadership in Dubai. Yeah,
that makes sense. I mean, even, in the UAE, if you even have 500,000 young people that have basic coding literacy, that's going to have a massive impact. But I know Xische and Co has worked a lot with smart cities and the idea of a smart city and the future of a smart city. What are you working on at the moment? And again, do you have any test cases that you think are incredibly neat for a foreign audience who might not know what's going on at
Sure.
the moment?
Yeah, I'm happy to share some, but also maybe a couple of building blocks on how Dubai came or arrived at its smart city initiative. Smart cities are not a new concept, as you know. They've been around for a long time, for several decades. And what's really funny is that we've been chasing exactly the same utopia for the last 30 years on what a smart city is meant to deliver. Do you agree with me?
Yeah, I read.
It's
I actually read one of your
almost
research
exactly
reports
the
about
same.
this. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Right. And so we fundamentally believe that smart cities is just a shiny new box to sell all technology. So a lot of vendors dislike when we say that, but it's true. And given that cities are working at looking at ways of partnering with the private sector, the big five tech companies always find a way to say, here's our solution and here's how this will benefit your city, and we will take on some of the investment. But then we become vendor cities. You've got a Samsung city and you've got an IBM city and you've got a Huawei city, and they're not really cities anymore. They're really just test cases for cities, for vendors. So in Dubai, what was unusual was that when we started working with them, they wanted to go out and say, we want to aim towards becoming one of the smartest cities in the world. We found a way to re-anchor that conversation and said, well, there's going to be 500 cities across China and India who are going to say exactly the same thing in the next 5 years. Perhaps it's worthwhile for us to anchor ourselves on a grander story. And so the idea of happiness as a metric, as a scientific metric to start measuring ourselves against, started to emerge within the Dubai government, rooted very much in the poetry of Sheikh Mohammed. So this is really quite interesting. So it was a poetic pursuit of Sheikh Mohammed sort of questioning what is the role of a leader. And he answers it in one of his poems as being happiness for his people. And so we thought, what if you root that to the end goal of smart cities, which becomes to create happiness for people, and technology just becomes the means towards the end, which is happiness. And that's kind of where Dubai's conversation around smart cities started. And so it's very unusual. A lot of other nations took notice and started to collaborate quite heavily right from the very beginning. They also made a very clear distinction between saying we're not a smart government, because Dubai has had a smart government or e-government initiative since 1999. They wanted to embrace the private sector just as much as they were focused on the government or the public sector. A couple of great examples of tangible case studies that have come out of this is the Dubai Health Authority has found a way to unify health records on across legacy fragmented systems where you really truly are connected across the government on health records. This is one of the things that would have only been possible had there been a unified effort at a city level rather than one entity trying to create a consolidated database. That's one great example of something that's already, it's called Salama, and it's already up and running. The Dubai police has experimented with getting their incident response system that is IoT driven. And again, it's part of the pilot projects that the Smart City drove to say, here are our 4 areas that we want to create impact on, and here's our 6 dimensions. I'm not going to bore you with this. This is rooted in Smart City methodology.
Yeah, was that the EU mapping report or something? I know
absolutely, indeed.
Yeah, it's quite interesting.
Yeah,
so
saying that is.
Dubai is working across all 6 dimensions, one of the only cities in the world. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So you're referencing Dr. Boyd's sort of the wheel framework, and that is correct. There's very few cities who've embraced all 6 dimensions genuinely, not just sort of lip service, but quite genuinely so. Another great one is the airport smart pass, where you have the ability of unifying or simplifying the experience of going through immigration, especially when you're exiting the UAE, using your digital identity, and that's, it's already up and running, and it's been phenomenal. All of these things could have happened individually, but the fact that they happen collaboratively and they're governed by a singular entity that is governed by a board that has representation from across the city is a really unique model for smart cities. Typically, smart city initiatives sit under the mayor's office or the governor's office, or they sit within the tech side of the city, so i.e. the government, the ICT for the government. But in Dubai, it's actually standalone. It works alongside agencies rather than as one sort of solo ranger trying to create change. These are just some of the case studies that come to mind at the moment. But one other thing that's worth noting is that they embrace data as a key.
That's what I was going to ask you next.
Driver.
Yeah. So it does seem
right.
like behind a lot of what we're discussing, data is at the center. And that was exactly what I was going to ask. So what are your thoughts on that?
So data it's been wonderful to watch Dubai mature across the data axis in the way that they have. They set up an establishment by decree to look at data as a priority, not just from a safety and security standpoint, but also from real value generated from data. So you can only start to make real value from data visible once you have access to a large volume of it. And I think this is where, if you look at the global convergence of the amount of data that we're creating, so 90% of all of the data that exists on our planet has been created in the last 2 years alone. This is a stat that you've heard several times before. Right. Dubai embraces this and understands this and says, well, okay, so we're sitting on a data footprint unlike ever before, but then we also have access to storage capacity with the cloud and processing power with chips sort of becoming quicker and quicker with Moore's law every 2 years. And then we have AI to help us sift through all of this data. So this convergence was something that Dubai picked up on quite early and decided to make data a true horizontal across the city and all of its ICT as well as decision making. I think it's important to create the distinction. A lot of people deal with data as a resource. Dubai deals with it and actually calls it on record as the next natural resource of the UAE that is more valuable than oil. This is on record from essentially the CEO of Dubai Data, which is the authority leading this initiative. And so they say, all right, we've got access to data, but then we also have the responsibility of creating value from data in a way that decision makers are able to make decisions on the basis of real-time data. I think this is where a lot of the governments do not quite fully embrace the last mile of what to do with data. They do a lot of work governing and collecting data. Yeah. But how do I make it meaningful to, collecting data, but not so much creating that last mile for decision makers to say, I will do this because of X and I will do this because of Y. I think that's where Dubai is prototyping this. I can't say they have accomplished what they set out to in all its totality, but they've certainly created some serious waves in making data front and center for leadership across the city.
Yeah, and I remember you mentioned something about a happiness dashboard where you can literally log
Indeed.
in and, so I'm guessing that part of the idea for that was as a prototype, as a way of visualizing different data sets and tracking sentiment in the country as a whole.
Indeed, and we've been really privileged to have been part of that story of the happiness meter right from the very beginning, where the happiness meter emerged as an idea to prove the viability of smart cities anchored around happiness. And what we didn't think would happen so quickly was its proliferation across not just the public sector, but also the private sector. So it was built as an internal system and then very quickly converted into this API-based system where everyone from the cinemas to the hospitals were able to get on the system. And what do they get in return? They get a great analysis of what the sentiment of their customers looks like at any given point. And what the city gets in return is this wonderful heat map of all of the experiences that are driving delight for citizens across the city. And that, in a way, completely reversed the role of accountability at city leadership. So if you think about it, typical leadership would report to the city leadership on a quarterly basis, on an annual basis, and therefore you can't retroactively go out and fix a problem that happened 6 months ago. But with something like the happiness meter, there's the right governance model to be able to say, happiness levels have dropped 3 points today, it's worth investigating. Or happiness levels in this area or this service provider have gone up 7 points, and that's worth investigating. So this real-time accountability has just made the government more agile and responsive in a seriously spectacular quick turnaround time that I've yet to see. So this is a wonderful case study of data and smart city objectives combining together in a way that the end user, a typical citizen, will experience and understand.
Yeah, and I mean, in a way, it's also an entirely new way of thinking about government itself and governance itself, which is another reason UAE is becoming incredibly interesting. So, look, Danish, thanks so much for your time. Before we go, one more question. Towards the start of the podcast, you mentioned that there was a strength in being an outsider and in looking at things as an outsider. And I'm sure a lot of people, when they're, curious about the UAE or looking into the UAE, one of their first questions is, well, how do I get involved? It's very far away. Finding information is very hard. What is the investment climate like? What is the scene like in general? Maybe could you possibly talk to that? Talk a bit about your experience of looking from the outside in at times, at the same time as being an insider?
Well, I think that's a really wonderful question. It's a layered question. I think the storytelling angle has an upside, but also has a downside. If we tell a story that is so grandiose that if you're sitting in the United States and you Google things, trying to do some research, some desktop research on Dubai or the UAE, you may be put off by the superlatives that you come across on the first 2 or 3 pages, which are all well rooted in reality, but they're more relevant to audiences that already understand what Dubai is. And so to say we're launching the world's first initiative of some kind, it's meaningful to people here because we're already operating and we've set our goal high. But internationally, that narrative may not always attract the right attention or may alienate people to think, oh, well, this is too big for me and maybe this isn't the right opportunity. So as a startup, as an investor, looking outside in may seem a little bit jarring, but I would urge against sort of creating that impression of Dubai from the outside. It really is this wonderful playground that allows you to experiment and test and prototype in a way that very few parts of the world would allow you to do something like that. Our experience working in this I think it has taught us a few things. It helps to be incidental and not always by design. We've evolved incidentally and not by design. It hasn't been a grand plan of 20 years to do what we do today. I also do not think that we would have managed to do what we've done or to create the little impact that we have had we been in any other city, because we were very fortunate to be in a city that was growing as rapidly as we were. And so for us, that story intersects in some ways, and some milestones are shared and some milestones are our milestones versus the city on its own. I think we've taken a lot from it, but it's always helped being the outsider because we have the liberty of not following the rules or the status quo within industries. And that has allowed us to really flourish and has been a guiding principle for us. And I always use the analogy of dots on a paper. We use one phrase more than any other phrase in our history, which is connecting the dots. You've got enough people putting the dots on a piece of paper, but the space in between the dots is where nobody wants to either spend time or to think about. And that is precisely where we live and exist and create value, is connecting the dots by being in between the dots. That's been the philosophy of being an outsider/insider. It's worked well for us, and we've learned from our inspiration, which is the city of Dubai, really.
Well, that's great. Danish Farhan, thank you so much for your time.